It was the winter of 1873, and the cold winds moved across the empty lands like invisible rivers of ice. The sky was dark and wide, full of stars that sparkled like tiny silver lamps. In the middle of that quiet, frozen land stood a single tent made of thick canvas. Inside the tent was a man named Samuel Whitlock, a trapper and traveler who had spent many nights alone in the wild. Samuel was a man in his early 30s. He had a calm face with sharp eyes that noticed everything. Life in the wild had made him quiet and careful. He had been riding and walking for days, moving westward with only his horse, a few supplies, and the warm fire inside his tent. It was the kind of night when even the coyotes did not cry out. The silence was deep, broken only by the soft crackling of burning wood. Samuel sat near the fire, rubbing his hands together. The warmth of the flames felt good against the biting cold. Outside, snowflakes were falling slowly, dancing in the wind before landing softly on the hard ground. He had built his camp carefully near a small creek that had frozen over, with rocks and trees giving some shelter from the harsh wind. Still, the cold crept in through the seams of the tent, making the air inside feel sharp. He pulled his blanket tighter around his shoulders. "This winter is a mean one," he whispered to himself. He didn't talk much, but sometimes he liked to hear his own voice just to feel less alone. A long journey can make even the strongest person crave a little sound. Suddenly, Samuel noticed something strange. A soft noise came from outside the tent. It was not the wind. It was light, almost like a footstep pressing on snow. He straightened his back, listening carefully. Years of living alone in the wild had taught him to trust his instincts. When something unusual happened, it usually meant danger, or at least it meant trouble. He reached for the lantern beside him and lifted it, letting its warm light spill across the inside of the tent. His heart beat a little faster, not from fear but from alertness. He leaned closer to the flap of the tent and listened again. This time he heard it clearly, slow, careful footsteps moving closer. Whoever or whatever it was, they were trying not to be heard. Samuel thought for a second. It could be a wild animal. It could be another traveler. Or it could be someone from the nearby Apache tribe. He had crossed into their land a few days earlier. He had no wish to cause trouble, but the world outside his tent was not always kind. Trust could be dangerous out here. With steady hands, Samuel opened the tent flap just enough to peek out. The wind rushed in, cold and sharp. The world outside was covered in white. The snow glowed faintly in the moonlight. And then he saw her. A young girl stood a few steps away from the tent. She looked to be around 16 or 17. She wore a thin, worn blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Her long dark hair hung loose, moving softly with the wind. Her cheeks were red from the cold. She wasn't holding a weapon. Her hands were raised slightly in front of her, palms open as if to say she meant no harm. Samuel didn't speak at first. He just watched her. She didn't speak either. The night seemed to hold its breath. Only the soft whistle of the wind moved between them. Then the girl took one careful step forward. Samuel noticed that her feet were bare. Her thin moccasins were torn, and snow had gathered around her ankles. She must have been walking for a long time in this freezing weather. Her lips were pale and she shivered badly. Samuel wasn't the kind of man who trusted strangers easily. But seeing her like that, alone, freezing, and clearly in trouble, something inside him softened. He slowly stepped aside and moved the flap wider, letting the warm light of the fire spill out onto the snow. "Come in," he said softly. His voice wasn't loud, but it was strong enough to be heard over the wind. The girl hesitated for a moment. Her dark eyes searched his face as if trying to read his intentions. Finally, she nodded once and stepped inside. As soon as she entered, the warmth of the tent wrapped around her like a soft blanket. She closed her eyes for a second, breathing out slowly. Samuel noticed how thin she was. Her hands were small and cold. Her clothes were simple and made of light fabric, not nearly enough to fight against a night like this. Samuel moved back to the fire and added another log. The flames grew brighter, filling the tent with a golden glow. The girl crouched near the fire, stretching her hands out to feel the heat. Her fingers trembled, but little by little the color returned to them. For the first time, Samuel could see her face clearly. She had delicate features, strong eyes, a soft jawline, and a quiet strength about her. Even in her tired state, there was something brave in the way she held herself. Samuel didn't want to frighten her with too many questions at once. So he sat across from her and kept his distance. "You've been walking in this cold?" he asked gently. She looked at him but didn't answer. It became clear that she spoke little or no English. She whispered something in Apache, her voice soft like the rustling of dry leaves. Samuel didn't understand the words, but the feeling was clear. She was tired, freezing, and needed warmth. Samuel nodded slowly, as if to say, "It's okay." He pulled an extra blanket from his pack and handed it to her. She accepted it with both hands, wrapping it tightly around herself. Her shoulders stopped shaking after a few minutes. The fire crackled between them. The outside world felt far away now. Inside the tent, time seemed to slow down. Samuel glanced at her feet and saw they were red and swollen from the cold. He poured some warm water from a small kettle into a cup and gently pushed it toward her. She looked at it, then at him, unsure at first, but when he nodded, she lifted the cup and took slow sips. The warmth seemed to travel through her entire body. Samuel leaned back a little, thinking. He had met people from the Apache tribes before, sometimes trading with them, sometimes just passing through without trouble. They were proud and strong people who knew the land well, but it was unusual to see someone from the tribe alone this far out, especially a young girl. Something must have happened. He didn't press her for answers, though. She needed rest, not questions. Outside, the wind howled like a restless ghost, but inside the tent, the fire glowed steadily, making the night less cruel. The girl whispered a word softly, almost to herself, Ayanna. Samuel guessed that must be her name. He repeated it carefully, Ayanna, and she gave a small nod. It wasn't a smile, but it was the closest thing to trust he'd seen in her so far. Hours passed quietly. Samuel stayed awake, listening to the wind and the occasional crack of ice outside. Ayanna sat near the fire, her eyes half closed, wrapped in the blanket he had given her. From time to time, she looked toward the tent flap as if expecting something or someone to appear. There was a deep uneasiness in her eyes, the kind that doesn't come from cold alone. Samuel noticed it but said nothing. He was a man who had learned to read signs, and every part of him knew this girl hadn't just wandered into his camp by chance. People didn't travel through the winter night without a reason, but whatever her story was, it could wait until morning. Samuel shifted the logs in the fire to keep it burning bright. The warmth spread through the tent again. He pulled his own blanket around him and leaned against his pack. "Sleep," he said gently, even though he knew she might not understand the word. He lowered his voice, almost like a whispering breeze. "It's safe here." Ayanna lowered her head slightly, maybe as a sign of thanks. She didn't lie down, though. She sat with her back against the wall of the tent as if staying ready for anything. Samuel understood that too. Trust takes time, especially out here. The night grew colder outside, but inside the air was soft and warm. Snow continued to fall, covering the land in white silence. Samuel thought about how strange life could be. He had planned to spend the night alone, just another night on his long journey. But now there was someone else here. A girl with a name that sounded like a song. A girl who carried a story in her eyes. A story she hadn't yet spoken. As the wind howled softly through the trees, Samuel let out a slow breath. Something had changed the moment she walked into his camp. He didn't know it yet, but this cold winter night would not be forgotten. This was not just another stop on his journey. It was the beginning of something unexpected. And though Ayanna said very little, Samuel could feel it deep down. She hadn't come only to warm up. There was more waiting outside in the dark. Something neither of them could ignore for long. Samuel woke up before dawn, just as the sky was changing from black to a deep, soft blue. The fire had burned low during the night, leaving only glowing red coals. Ayanna was still inside the tent, sitting exactly as she had the night before. She had not stretched out to sleep. Her knees were pulled up close to her chest, and the blanket was wrapped tightly around her. She was awake. Samuel noticed how alert she was. Her dark eyes watched the flap of the tent like a fox waiting for a sound in the forest. She looked small wrapped in that thick blanket, but something about her seemed strong, like the way old trees bend in the wind but do not break. "Good morning," Samuel said softly. His voice was calm, careful not to startle her. Ayanna turned to look at him. She didn't answer in words, but she gave a short nod. It wasn't a smile, but it felt like a sign of trust, just a little more than last night. Samuel slowly pushed the blanket off his shoulders and got up. The air inside the tent was cold, but outside it was colder. He opened the flap and a rush of frosty air touched his face. The land outside was covered in a thick white blanket of snow. The trees stood still, dressed in icy coats. His horse was tied to a post nearby, its breath making little white clouds in the air. The world was quiet. Too quiet. Samuel stepped out, stretching his arms, and took a long breath of the cold morning air. He was used to the silence of the wilderness. It was part of his life. But this silence felt a little different. It wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of quiet that comes before something happens. He walked to his saddlebag and took out a small kettle. He filled it with snow and placed it over the coals inside the tent to melt into water. Ayanna watched him closely, as if studying every move he made. She did not look away, even for a second. As the snow began to melt, Samuel turned toward her and said gently, "You must be hungry." She didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. He reached into his pack and pulled out some dry biscuits and a small piece of jerky. He placed it in front of her without forcing her to take it. She waited a moment, then carefully picked it up. Her hands were no longer shaking like last night, but she still moved slowly, as if she didn't fully trust the world around her. She ate quietly, each bite small and cautious. Samuel didn't rush her. He sat on the other side of the fire and drank a bit of warm water. Outside, the wind picked up, making soft whistling sounds around the tent. Ayanna finished eating and set the small piece of cloth he had given her on the ground. Then she lifted her hand to her chest and said softly, "Ayanna." She was telling him her name again, but this time it wasn't a whisper of fear. It was clear and calm. Samuel nodded. "Ayanna," he repeated. He placed his hand over his own chest. "Samuel." Her eyes brightened just a little. "Samuel," she said, carefully repeating the name. It was a simple moment, but it felt important. Out here, words didn't always build trust. Sometimes a single shared name could. Samuel started to pack a few of his things. He didn't like staying too long in one place. It made him feel like a target. Usually by sunrise, he would have been miles away, following the river and moving deeper into the wilderness. But now things were different. He couldn't just leave a young girl out here alone. Ayanna stood up, still wrapped in the blanket. She looked toward the trees and then back at him. Her eyes were sharp, searching the forest. Her fingers moved nervously with the edge of the blanket. Samuel noticed. "You're looking for something," he said quietly. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the feeling in his voice. She pointed toward the forest. Then she held two fingers to her ear as if to show she was listening. Samuel stopped moving. He listened too. At first he heard nothing, just the sound of the wind brushing against the trees. Then very softly there it was, a distant sound. It was faint but clear enough. Someone or something was moving out there. Samuel straightened his back. His senses became sharp, like a deer smelling danger in the air. He slowly walked outside and scanned the tree line. The snow stretched far in every direction. He saw no figures, no smoke, no movement. But the sound was real. Someone was out there. Ayanna stepped up beside him. Her eyes followed the same direction his were facing. For a moment they stood side by side in silence. Two people from different worlds, but both understanding the same feeling. Someone was near. Samuel turned to her. "Friends?" he asked softly, pointing toward the forest. Ayanna shook her head quickly. "No," she said. It was the first English word he heard from her. Her face was serious. Whatever or whoever was out there, it was not someone she wanted near. Samuel's thoughts moved quickly. He didn't know her story yet, but it was becoming clear she wasn't just a lost traveler. She had come here for a reason. Or maybe she was running from one. The cold wind grew stronger. The trees swayed slightly. Samuel walked back into the tent, thinking fast. If someone was tracking her, they might already know where she was. His campfire from last night would have been easy to spot from far away. Ayanna followed him in. Her steps were quiet, almost silent on the snow. Inside, her hands gripped the blanket tighter. She kept glancing at the tent flap as if expecting it to move. Samuel spoke slowly, choosing simple words. Someone follow you?" He pointed to her, then toward the forest. She understood. She nodded once. Then she held up 2 fingers, then 3. More than one person. Samuel exhaled slowly. This was not good. Ayanna walked to the tent flap and pulled it slightly open, peeking outside. Samuel noticed how careful she was. She wasn't just a scared girl anymore. She moved with quiet awareness like someone who had learned to survive. Her eyes scanned the snow like a hawk searching for movement. "Who are they?" Samuel asked softly, even though he knew she wouldn't understand. She turned to him and spoke in Apache. He couldn't understand the words, but her face told him enough. She was afraid, but she was not weak. There was something behind those dark eyes, a story she wasn't ready to share yet. Samuel stepped forward and pulled the flap closed. He didn't want the cold or the outside world sneaking in. For now, the tent was their small safe space, but it would not stay safe forever. The hours passed slowly. The morning turned brighter, but the snow kept falling lightly like feathers. Samuel and Ayanna spoke little. They didn't need to. The silence between them was filled with a kind of understanding. Sometimes trust doesn't need many words. It grows quietly like a fire that burns steady without sparks. Around mid-morning, Samuel decided to make some plans. He couldn't just sit in the tent and wait for whatever was out there to find them. If there really were people following Ayanna, staying here too long would be a mistake. He packed some of his supplies into a smaller bag. Ayanna watched him closely, as if trying to guess what he was thinking. Samuel looked at her and pointed to the forest, then to the west. "We move," he said simply. Ayanna hesitated for a moment. Then slowly she nodded. She unwrapped the blanket just enough to move more freely. She tied the extra fabric around her shoulders like a shawl. Her face was calm, but Samuel could see something in her eyes, something quiet and determined. She had faced difficult things before. Samuel opened the flap and looked outside again. The sound from earlier was gone, but that didn't mean the danger was. He motioned for her to stay close to him. Together they stepped out into the snowy world. The wind brushed their faces like icy fingers. As they walked, Samuel kept glancing around. He moved carefully, making sure their steps left light marks in the snow. His horse followed behind them, its hooves soft against the frozen ground. Ayanna walked a few steps behind at first, but as the minutes passed, she slowly moved closer to his side. She didn't speak, but she seemed to trust that moving with him was safer than staying alone. They crossed a small frozen creek and entered a thick patch of trees. The forest was quiet but not empty. Samuel could feel it. The same strange silence from the morning was following them. Somewhere beyond the trees, someone was watching. Ayanna stopped suddenly and touched his arm. She pointed to the ground ahead. Samuel crouched down and saw it too. Light footprints in the snow. Fresh ones, not his, not hers. Someone had passed through here not long ago. Samuel looked up at the trees and then back at her. Their eyes met. No words were needed. They both understood. Whoever was out there was closer than they thought. Ayanna tightened the blanket around her shoulders and stood straighter. Her face changed. The fear in her eyes didn't disappear, but it became something else, something stronger. Samuel didn't know what the next hours would bring, but he did know one thing for sure. This girl had brought more than a quiet night to his camp. She had brought a storm with her, one that had not yet reached its peak. The cold wind moved through the trees again. It sounded like a whisper, carrying a warning neither of them could ignore. And far away in the shadow of the snowy forest, footsteps slowly returned. The sun was higher now, though it gave little warmth. Its pale light spread across the snowy land like a soft silver sheet. Samuel and Ayanna moved carefully through the forest, their breath visible in the cold air. The quiet was deep and heavy, the kind of quiet that makes even the smallest sound seem loud. Each step they took crunched softly against the snow, leaving behind a thin trail of footprints. Samuel's senses were sharp. He scanned the trees, the shadows, and the ground. He had spent many years traveling through lonely places like this. He could tell when something wasn't right, and this feeling was clear. Someone was following them. Ayanna walked close beside him now. Her eyes moved constantly, watching everything. She didn't speak, but her silence was full of meaning. Samuel didn't need words to know she felt it too. The forest might have looked calm, but it was not empty. After about half an hour of walking, they reached a small hill. From the top, they could see the white plains stretching far and wide. The snow glittered under the weak sunlight. In the distance, black dots moved slowly across the land. At first, they were hard to see clearly, but then Samuel noticed it. They weren't dots. They were riders. More than one. He didn't show fear, but his heart grew heavier. This was no simple chance meeting. Someone had truly been on Ayanna's trail, Ayanna saw them too. Her hands tightened around the edge of the blanket on her shoulders. Her face turned serious and her breathing grew quiet and steady. She didn't panic. It was as if she already knew this moment would come. Samuel led her down the other side of the hill. "We keep moving," he said softly, even though she might not understand all his words. His voice was steady and low. She followed without question. The forest grew thicker the deeper they went. The tall pines stood close together, their branches heavy with snow. The ground was uneven with rocks and fallen logs hidden beneath the white surface. It was harder to walk, but that also meant it would be harder for anyone to follow their trail. Samuel stopped near a cluster of thick bushes. He turned to Ayanna and placed a finger to his lips, a sign to stay quiet. She nodded right away. She understood this kind of silence, not the peaceful kind, but the careful kind. The kind that keeps you safe. They crouched low, letting the bushes cover them. Samuel peered through the trees toward the open hill behind them. After a few moments, he saw movement, shadows between the trees. The riders had come closer. They were still far enough away that he couldn't see their faces, but close enough to know they were looking for something, or someone. Samuel felt the cold air on his face, but inside, he was warm with alertness. He didn't want trouble. He had spent most of his life avoiding it. But trouble had a way of finding people who least expected it. He turned to Ayanna and whispered, "Who are they?" He pointed back toward the shadows in the distance. Ayanna didn't answer in words. She lifted her hand and pressed it against her heart. Then, with her other hand, she made a gesture like something being pulled away. Samuel didn't understand everything, but he understood enough. Whoever they were connected to her past. Ayanna lowered her eyes for a moment. The look on her face wasn't just fear, it was something deeper. It was the look of someone who had been carrying a heavy story for a long time. Samuel realized then that she wasn't just trying to escape the cold or find safety for a single night. She was running from something much larger. The riders moved slowly across the open hill, scanning the forest below. One of them pointed toward the line of trees, and the others followed. They were coming closer. Samuel turned to Ayanna and spoke softly, slowly, hoping she would understand. "We can't stay here." He pointed to the west, deeper into the forest. "We move." Ayanna gave a small nod. Her face was calm, but her eyes shone with quiet strength. She was not weak. She had already survived a lot before meeting him. That much was clear. They began to move again, this time even more carefully. Samuel chose the narrowest paths, ones where their footprints would be harder to follow. Ayanna followed his steps exactly, quiet as falling snow. For a long time, they didn't speak at all. The only sounds were the soft crunching of their boots and the whisper of the wind through the branches. Samuel's mind worked quickly. He wasn't sure where they would go. He didn't have a real plan yet, but he knew one thing. If they stayed in one place too long, they would be found. After another stretch of walking, they reached a narrow stream. It was half frozen, but a thin line of water still ran through it. Samuel paused there, studying the water. A small idea came to his mind. If they walked along the stream, it might cover their tracks for a while. He looked at Ayanna and pointed to the water. "Here," he said simply. Then he stepped carefully into the shallow stream. The water was freezing cold, but it didn't rise above his boots. Ayanna hesitated for only a moment before following him. The icy water made their steps slower, but it also erased their footprints behind them. It was a trick Samuel had learned years ago when he wanted to move unseen. The stream twisted and turned through the forest like a silver ribbon. They followed it for what felt like a long time. Samuel could feel the cold biting through his boots, but he ignored it. He focused on the sound of the forest around them, listening for anything out of place. Finally, he led them out of the stream and up a small ridge where the trees grew thick. The ground here was covered in deep snow, untouched. Samuel stopped near a fallen tree. He brushed away some snow and sat down for a moment, breathing slowly. Ayanna sat across from him, wrapping the blanket tighter around her shoulders. For a few minutes, they rested in silence. Samuel watched her closely. She sat still, but he could tell her mind was busy. Her eyes shifted from the trees to the ground, to the distance, and back again. It wasn't the restless movement of someone who didn't know what to do. It was the careful scanning of someone who had learned to be alert all the time. Samuel broke the silence with a quiet voice. "Ayanna," he said gently. "Who are they?" She didn't understand every word, but she knew what he was asking. Her hands moved as she spoke softly in Apache. She pressed her fingers to her chest, then made a sweeping gesture behind her, then pointed east. Samuel tried to follow the movements. It wasn't a clear story, but little by little, he began to understand pieces. She had left something behind. There were people who didn't want her to go, and they were following her now. Ayana's eyes softened for a moment as she looked down. Samuel could see a quiet sadness there, not loud or dramatic, just deep like water under ice. He realized she wasn't just running because of fear. She was running because she had no other choice. Samuel leaned back against the tree and let out a slow breath. He wasn't used to caring about other people's problems. His life had always been simple: move, hunt, trade, survive. But something about this girl, about the quiet strength in her eyes, made him want to help, even if he didn't fully understand why. Suddenly a sound broke through the quiet. A soft crack, not from them but from the forest below. It was faint but clear. Someone had stepped on a branch. Samuel and Ayana both froze at the same time. Their eyes met. No words were needed. They knew what it meant. The riders had come closer. Samuel raised his finger to his lips again. Ayana nodded without hesitation. She moved slowly, crouching lower, blending into the snowy shadows like she had done this many times before. The forest was silent again. A cold wind brushed the trees. Then another soft sound came, closer this time. Samuel's heartbeat grew louder in his ears, not from fear but from focus. He wasn't a man who ran from trouble easily, but he wasn't a fool either. Ayana reached for the side of the blanket, holding it close so it wouldn't make a sound. Her breathing was calm and steady even now. Samuel realized something in that moment. She wasn't just a frightened girl in the snow. She had been through things that had taught her how to survive. The shadows of figures began to move between the trees in the distance. They weren't close enough to see faces yet, but they were near. Samuel watched them carefully. He could tell they were searching, looking for signs, trying to pick up a trail. For a brief second, the sunlight slipped through the branches and touched Ayana's face. Samuel saw her eyes clearly. They weren't just scared, they were ready. And then something unexpected happened. Ayana gently placed her hand on Samuel's arm. Her touch was light, but it carried a clear message. She was not going to run anymore. She wanted to face whatever was coming. Samuel didn't speak. He only nodded slowly. He didn't fully understand her story, but he understood her courage. The footsteps in the distance grew a little louder, then paused. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. They sat perfectly still, hidden behind the ridge. The snowflakes drifted down quietly, landing on their hair and shoulders. Time seemed to stretch thin. Samuel thought about the night she had appeared at his tent, cold, quiet, and alone. He had thought it was a simple moment, a stranger seeking warmth. But now he knew the truth. That night had been the beginning of something bigger. Ayana wasn't just a guest at his camp anymore. She was part of his journey now, and somewhere out there, just beyond the trees, the people following her were closer than ever. The wind moved through the forest like a whisper, and for the first time, Samuel didn't feel completely alone. He had a feeling that whatever came next would change everything. The forest was quiet now, but the silence carried a tension that made every sound seem louder. Snowflakes drifted down slowly, landing on the branches and glistening in the faint sunlight. Samuel and Ayana remained crouched behind the ridge, hidden from the distant figures moving through the trees. Each of them was still, alert, waiting for the right moment to act. Ayana's dark eyes scanned the forest constantly. She had a way of noticing things that Samuel sometimes missed, even after years of living in the wild. A small branch broken here, a footprint there, her senses were sharp, trained by experience. He realized she was not just cautious. She was aware in a way that came from knowing the world could change in an instant. Samuel spoke softly in simple words so she might understand. "We move soon," he said. His voice was calm, but it carried urgency. "Stay close." Ayana nodded and adjusted the blanket around her shoulders. She had stopped trembling, and there was a quiet determination in her posture. Samuel knew she had faced hardship before, and he also knew that she was capable of more than she looked. They waited for a few more minutes, watching the forest below. The distant figures moved slowly, scanning carefully, clearly looking for signs of their trail. Samuel guessed they had no idea that he and Ayana were hiding nearby. That gave them an advantage, but only a small one. Finally, Samuel decided it was time to move. He stood carefully, motioning for Ayana to follow. She rose as well, her movement slow and deliberate, blending with the shadows. They stepped lightly through the snow, following a narrow path between the trees. The forest floor was uneven, covered with hidden rocks and fallen branches, but they moved without making noise. Samuel led the way, his eyes constantly scanning the shadows. Ayana stayed close, her steps almost echoing his, her presence quiet but steady. After a while, they reached a small clearing. Sunlight touched the snow here, making it sparkle like tiny crystals. Samuel crouched low, considering their next move. The riders had been close, but now they seemed to be moving away, or perhaps searching a different part of the forest. It was hard to tell. Samuel turned to Ayana. He tried to speak slowly, choosing simple words. "We need rest," he said, pointing to a fallen tree that could serve as a bench. She understood immediately. They both lowered themselves to the snow-dusted log. Samuel pulled out some biscuits from his bag and handed them to her. She took them carefully, unwrapping them slowly. Her hands no longer shook. He offered some to himself but didn't eat right away. He kept his attention on the trees, listening for anything unusual. Ayana chewed quietly, her eyes still scanning the forest. Samuel realized that even when eating, she stayed alert. This was not someone who would let her guard down easily, and he respected that. After a while, Ayana spoke softly, in her language. Samuel didn't understand the words, but the tone was not afraid. It was calm, almost thoughtful. He smiled faintly. Even if he couldn't understand her words, he could understand the meaning behind them. She was thinking, planning, and observing. Samuel decided it was time to share a little of his own knowledge with her. He pointed to the sun and then toward the west. "We go west," he said. "Safe place?" Ayana tilted her head, considering. Then she nodded. Samuel could see that she trusted him, even though they had only known each other for a short time. Trust could be slow in the wilderness, but it could also form quickly in moments of danger. They moved again, keeping low and careful. Samuel led them through a narrow path where the trees formed a natural wall, hiding them from view. The snow here was softer, and the footprints they left were quickly covered by falling snowflakes. As they walked, Samuel thought about the journey ahead. He didn't know exactly where they were going, but he knew that staying in one place too long was dangerous. Whoever had been following Ayana would not give up easily. He had to find a safe spot, somewhere hidden, where they could rest and plan their next move. Ayana noticed something ahead and stopped suddenly. She crouched and pointed to a small animal track in the snow. It was fresh. Samuel leaned down and examined it. The tracks were small, almost like those of a fox or rabbit, but they indicated movement in the forest. He looked at her. "Not human," he said. She nodded. It was clear she understood. Her eyes softened a little. Samuel realized she had grown up in these forests. She knew the signs of animals, the flow of the land, and the way the forest moved. She wasn't just surviving, she was at home here. They continued along the path, moving slowly and quietly. The sun rose higher, warming the snow just enough to make it glitter like diamonds. Birds chirped softly in the trees, breaking the silence in small musical bursts. Samuel noticed how different the forest felt in daylight. The shadows of the night had gone, replaced by a soft, calm light that made the forest seem less threatening. But the forest still held secrets. Samuel could feel it in the way the wind shifted, in the sudden silence between the bird songs. Something was watching. He glanced at Ayana. She was alert, scanning the trees with her sharp eyes. After some time, they came to a small stream. The water was clear and fast-moving, its gentle sound filling the quiet. Samuel knelt and cupped some water in his hands, letting it flow to his lips. Ayana did the same, drinking carefully. The cold water refreshed them both. They rested near the stream for a short while, letting their muscles relax. Samuel studied her carefully. She seemed younger than he first thought, but there was wisdom in her eyes. She had endured hardships he could not imagine, and yet she remained calm and strong. Samuel spoke softly, trying to explain what he knew. "We keep moving. Follow stream. Then forest thick," he said, pointing ahead. Ayana nodded. She understood enough. They began walking again, following the stream. The path became more difficult, with rocks and fallen branches hidden beneath the snow. Samuel kept his steps steady, testing each one before putting his weight down. Ayana followed exactly, learning from him as they moved. Suddenly, Ayana stopped. She crouched and held up her hand. Samuel froze. He looked in the direction she was pointing. A shadow moved between the trees. It was human. Samuel lowered his body, signaling Ayanna to do the same. The figure passed slowly, not noticing them hidden behind a thick cluster of bushes. Samuel's heart beat faster, but he stayed calm. Whoever it was, they hadn't seen them. For now, they were safe. Ayanna looked at him, her eyes calm but alert. Samuel could see that she understood the danger. She had faced it before and knew how to handle it. Her trust in him was quiet, steady, and unspoken. They waited for a few minutes, letting the figure disappear into the distance. Then, carefully, they continued along the stream. Each step was measured, each sound controlled. Samuel realized that he had never met anyone like Ayanna before. She was quiet but strong, cautious but brave. Hours passed and the forest began to change. The trees grew taller and closer together. The snow was deeper, and the light from the sun was dimmer under the thick branches. Samuel knew they were getting to the dense part of the forest, the safest place he could think of. Finally, they reached a small natural clearing. It was hidden by tall trees and thick underbrush. The snow here was untouched and the air was calm. Samuel pointed to the ground. "Here." "Safe," he said. Ayanna looked around carefully, then nodded. She lowered herself to the snow-covered ground and rested. Samuel joined her, setting his pack nearby. They were quiet, but neither of them relaxed completely. The forest was still alive with sounds, and danger could be near at any moment. Samuel watched Ayanna for a moment. She leaned back against a tree, her blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders. She was quiet, but her eyes were alert. Samuel realized something important. This girl had taught him something he hadn't expected. Even in the cold, in the fear, and in the unknown, courage could shine quietly without words. He didn't speak for a long time. The silence was peaceful in its own way. Then softly he said, "Rest. We safe now. For a little while." Ayanna looked at him, understanding. She didn't need to say anything. The small gesture of trust, of simply being there, was enough. For the first time since the journey began, Samuel felt a small sense of relief. They were hidden. They were together. And for now, that was enough. Outside, the wind moved through the branches, carrying soft whispers. Snow fell gently, covering the footprints they had left. The forest seemed alive but protective. Samuel looked at Ayanna and thought about the journey ahead. It would not be easy, but he realized one thing clearly. With her courage and his knowledge of the land, they could face whatever came next. The forest waited silently, holding its secrets as Samuel and Ayanna rested in the quiet, hidden from the world outside. The forest was quieter now, but the quiet carried a tension that neither Samuel nor Ayanna could ignore. Snowflakes continued to drift slowly to the ground, covering every leaf and branch with a soft white blanket. The sunlight, pale and weak, filtered through the tall pines, casting long shadows across the forest floor. Every sound seemed amplified, the whisper of the wind, the creak of a branch, the distant call of a bird. Samuel and Ayanna had rested for only a short while. Even though the dense trees provided cover, Samuel knew that danger could return at any moment. Whoever had been following Ayanna was still nearby, and their journey was not yet over. He had learned that out here, being cautious was the only way to survive. Ayanna rose first, her dark eyes scanning the shadows. She had been quiet for most of the day, but there was a new determination in her posture. She had rested enough to regain her strength, and it was clear that she would not let fear control her now. Samuel watched her carefully, admiring her courage. It was a quiet kind of bravery, not loud or dramatic, but steady and strong. Samuel stood beside her and looked toward the direction they had come from. "We move," he said softly. His voice was calm, deliberate, but full of urgency. "Keep low. Follow me." Ayanna nodded and stepped carefully beside him. She had learned quickly from the past hours that moving slowly and silently was crucial. Each step they took was measured, controlled, leaving as little trace as possible. The snow was deep in some places, but Samuel led her through the narrowest paths where the ground was firm, and the snow less likely to show their footprints. They moved for what felt like hours. The forest grew thicker, the trees closer together, their branches forming a natural roof that blocked much of the weak sunlight. The snow was softer here, muffling their steps. Samuel felt a small sense of relief. They were deeper into the forest now, harder to find, but the tension remained. He could feel it in the way the wind shifted, in the strange silence of the forest. Suddenly, Ayana stopped and crouched low. Samuel froze beside her. She pointed ahead and he followed her gaze. There, in a small clearing just a short distance away, he could see shadows moving between the trees. They were the riders, the people who had been following her. Samuel lowered himself to the ground, signaling Ayana to do the same. They pressed themselves against the thick underbrush, hidden from view. The riders were close enough now that Samuel could make out their shapes. They were moving slowly, scanning the forest, clearly searching for signs of Ayana and him. Samuel whispered softly to her, "We can't let them see us." "Stay quiet, wait." Ayana nodded, her eyes sharp and alert. Samuel noticed how calm she was, even in the presence of danger. She had survived difficult situations before, and it showed in the way she held herself. She didn't panic. She didn't hesitate. She was ready. The riders moved slowly past the clearing, their attention focused elsewhere. Samuel and Ayana remained perfectly still, barely breathing. The tension in the forest was like a weight pressing down on them. Each second felt stretched, each sound amplified. When the riders finally moved out of sight, Samuel exhaled slowly. "We move now," he said, still keeping his voice low. They continued through the forest, moving carefully, staying low and hidden. The stream they had followed earlier became a guide, its soft sound masking the noise of their steps. Samuel led Ayana deeper into the thickest part of the forest, a place where the trees were so close together that light barely touched the ground. It was a natural fortress, a place where they could rest safely for a longer time. Finally, they reached a small, hidden clearing. The snow here was untouched, as if the forest itself had protected it. Samuel set down his pack and turned to Ayana. "Safe now," he said. She looked around, confirming that no one could see them from outside. The tension in her shoulders relaxed slightly, but she remained alert. They sat together, catching their breath. Samuel pulled out some biscuits and shared them with Ayana. She accepted them quietly, eating slowly, but her eyes never stopped scanning the forest. Samuel realized that she had learned to be aware at all times. Even when resting, she remained vigilant. After a few minutes, Samuel spoke softly. "You strong," he said. "Not just smart. Strong." Ayana looked at him, her dark eyes steady. She didn't speak, but her expression showed a quiet acknowledgement. Samuel understood that words were not necessary. They both knew the hardships she had faced and the courage she had shown. The forest was peaceful for a moment, but Samuel knew it wouldn't last. They had made it this far, but the journey ahead was still uncertain. Whoever had been following her might still find them. He had to be ready to move again if needed. Ayana leaned back against a tree, her blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders. She was quiet, but Samuel could see the determination in her eyes. She had been running for a long time, but now, with him by her side, she seemed ready to face whatever came next. Hours passed, and the sunlight began to fade. The forest was growing colder, but Samuel and Ayana remained alert. They had no fire tonight, as light or smoke could give away their position. Instead, they relied on their senses and the protection of the thick trees. As darkness approached, Samuel thought about their situation. They had survived so far through caution, patience, and quiet movements. But the night would bring new challenges. He could feel the forest shifting, the shadows growing longer, the sounds of animals and wind carrying differently. Ayana sensed it too. She stood and adjusted her blanket, her movements deliberate and careful. Samuel followed her lead, understanding that she had a plan in mind even if he didn't know exactly what it was. Suddenly, a soft sound reached their ears, a distant noise, faint but deliberate. Samuel froze. He recognized it immediately. It was not the sound of animals. It was human. Someone was moving through the forest again, searching. He signaled for Ayana to stay quiet and crouched low. They waited, hidden behind a thick tree trunk. The sound grew closer. Samuel could see the faint shadows of movement between the trees. Ayana pressed her hand gently against his arm. Her eyes met his, and he understood her message. They were ready. She had been preparing for this moment. The shadows came into view, moving slowly. Samuel stayed calm, guiding Ayana silently through the trees, staying just out of sight. He could see that the riders were careful, but they had not noticed them. Finally, they reached a narrow path that led deeper into the forest. Samuel motioned for Ayana to follow. They moved quickly but quietly, the snow crunching softly under their boots. Each step was deliberate, designed to avoid detection. After what felt like an eternity, they reached another hidden clearing, larger and safer than before. The forest around them was dense, the trees forming a natural barrier. Samuel allowed himself a small sigh of relief. They had made it this far without being seen. Ayanna looked around carefully, then turned to Samuel. She spoke a few words in Apache. Samuel didn't understand, but the tone was calm and decisive. He nodded. He understood the meaning. They would rest here, and when the time came, they would move again. They set up a small area for resting, using fallen branches and snow to create a hidden shelter. Samuel shared some water from his canteen. Ayanna drank carefully, her eyes never leaving the forest. As night fell, the forest grew darker, the trees casting long shadows over the snow. Samuel and Ayanna remained close together, alert but calm. They had survived so much already, and they knew that their journey had only just begun. For the first time, Samuel allowed himself to feel something he hadn't in a long time. Hope. Hope that with courage, careful planning, and trust, they could make it through whatever challenges lay ahead. Ayanna looked at him, her dark eyes steady and determined. Samuel realized that this young girl, who had seemed fragile when she first appeared at his tent, was stronger than anyone he had ever known. Together they could face the forest, the snow, and any obstacle that might come. The forest was alive with quiet sounds, the wind moving through the trees, the faint rustle of animals, the whisper of snow falling. Samuel and Ayanna sat together, ready to face the night, knowing that as long as they had each other, they could survive anything. And somewhere beyond the trees, the riders had stopped. They could not find the hidden clearing, could not see the small figures of Samuel and Ayanna blending into the shadows. For now, the forest had protected them, and the quiet night held them safe. Samuel looked at Ayanna, and for the first time since they had met, he smiled faintly. "Safe for now," he said softly. She nodded, a small but confident smile appearing on her face. They rested there side by side, knowing that they had survived the day, the pursuit, and the unknown. They had found strength in each other, courage in the quiet and hope in the heart of the forest. The forest seemed to approve, wrapping them in its quiet protection, the snow falling softly around them. And in that moment, Samuel and Ayanna knew that they were not just surviving, they were living together, ready to face whatever the world might bring next. The night stretched on, calm and silent, but full of promise.